Hello, I'm Ed Butler. Welcome to Business Daily from the BBC. Today, the frugal life. When is it better to get by with less?
I don't like to think of it as frugality. It's more of a philosophy and living the good life. Frugality just happens to be a very efficient path to a happier life.
And for those with a financial reason to save, could we perhaps do better storing our food?
Every second Dane has UFOs in their freezers.
I beg your pardon? Unidentified flying objects in their freezers?
No, UFOs are the unidentified frozen objects.
Uncovering the X-Files about a life of thrift. Business Daily from the BBC. Now, there's long been talk about peak oil, the point at which the amount of hydrocarbons available to us starts an inexorable downward decline. Well, what about peak stuff? In a surprising intervention earlier this year, Steve Howard, the head of sustainability at the Swedish furniture giant IKEA, said that he reckons the apparently ever-increasing clutter of products in our lives has hit a high watermark.
I don't think we're there yet. My comment about peak stuff was, if you take the total material impact of society in the West, it's probably just about peaked. But then if you say, well, we exist in that world too. But what we'll make sure that we do is, we will always say we'd like to act in the best interests of our customers.
Strange, you might think, coming from a company that still wants to double its sales by 2020. Strange, perhaps, coming from any major company.
It is surprising because certainly American society and global society is really predicated on consumption, materialism, the idea that more is better, that consumption is good for the economy.
That's Andrew Yarrow, a senior fellow at Washington's Aspen Institute and author of Thrift, the history of an American cultural movement. In today's programme, we want to look at how ready we are culturally in the developed world to adjust to this new frugal living that people are talking about. The idea that peak stuff isn't just a future aim, it's actually a mindset that many of us already embrace.
There's a huge element of economic need. About 40% of Americans are paid less than $15 an hour. A similar 40% have not enough financial assets to tide them over for more than a couple months. So there is the whole aspect of need. On the other hand, there is a tension today pushing for a more simple life, for using resources more wisely. Talk about sustainability, stewardship for the earth. In American history, Ben Franklin was sort of the apostle of thrift. For about a decade and a half, there were annual thrift weeks that would begin on Franklin's birthday each year, January 17.
What was in a thrift week?
Well, each day had a different thrifty value, like save for old age, home ownership, buy life insurance, a quirky batch of ideas. So thrift has definitely had both a moral/philosophical lineage as well as a financial one.
Andrew Yarrow of the Aspen Institute. So what does thrift or frugal living look like close up? Meet Pete Adeney, also known as Mr. Money Mustache. He's a former software engineer who stashed away much of his very decent but not extraordinary income and retired at the age of 30. Today, 10 years on, he gets by with his wife and child in semi-rural Colorado in the US on a living of about $25,000 a year. He reckons he can do that now for the rest of his life, and he plans never to work for money again, although he does like to write blogs about it.
To me, it's just living what I think is already a luxurious life, but from the outside looking in, people might find it strange that I don't drive a car as much as the average American. I only use a few tanks of gas per year because I prefer to ride a bike and I prefer to find things and friends that are near my home. So a lot less travel. We still do a certain amount of plane travel. And then in every other category, I've just kind of optimized things to the best that I could, like cook a lot of food at home and try to do my own home maintenance. I cut my own hair just because I prefer getting it done instantly than going to the barber shop. But these little things add up to surprising amounts, like just bringing your lunch to work, for example, can make something like a $35,000 difference over 10 years if you just kept that money and invested it.
Yeah. What are you wearing right now, Pete? I mean, describe your attire. Presumably it's not designer wear.
Well, I am a bit of a fashion hound at times, but right now I'm still in my pajamas because it is 10 a.m. in the mountain time zone of the U.S., and I've been hanging around with my wife and son and having a leisurely breakfast. I like to make the most of the mornings, and there's no rush to begin work because work will always be there for you when you want to.
I mean, what do you do? I mean, I saw, for example, one reference, one of your blogs talking about, building a box to stick on the back of your car so that you would double the capacity of your small vehicle.
Right. Well, I guess you could describe that as work. That's kind of a project that I did once. Right now, I'm currently talking to you as another example of something that a retired person might do. My true passion in life turns out to be building things like carpentry and building houses and designing things and optimizing houses to be super energy efficient. So I spend some of my free time helping friends with their projects. The biggest thing is really just spending time with my son. He's 10 years old. He's still in the stage where dad is a fun thing in his life. So that's at least 60% of my waking hours.
You say that, but also it's blogging about your frugal existence, right? I mean, you have many thousands of followers. How many do you have, in fact?
It's a really tricky question for a blogger to answer. It just depends on how you measure it. So in the last 30-day period, I think about 750,000. And in the lifetime of it, which is about 5 years, it says 17 million people. So
it suggests that frugality is something that Americans like to think about right now.
That's a little bit of an F word in my book. I don't like to think of it as frugality. It's more of a philosophy and living the good life. It's really a blog about happiness rather than money or frugality. Frugality just happens to be a very efficient path to a happier life.
Isn't work part of happiness?
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. The biggest thing that I learned from retirement is that there's no such thing as real retirement to an active, sort of energetic person. I love to work, and I get very cranky if I spend more than about half a day on the couch. So the point in my flavor of retirement is just not having mandatory work, so you don't have to sacrifice your soul to do things you don't believe in just for a paycheck.
What do you put your popularity down to? Do you think it's a symptom of kind of post-crisis America, or is it a symptom of a sense that there's too much stuff being chucked at us, cheap, worthless products perhaps?
That's a really good question. My guess is just people want steps to give them a better life, and this is the same reason things like personal finance is popular. I just happen to do it with a bit more profanity and less corporate influence, so that appeals to certain people.
Okay, one single tip. If you imagine your average Western world consumer listening to this thing, what would you say for a baby step for someone who just is addicted to his stuff and his products and his spending patterns?
If you want a concrete tip, I would say just make sure you have a working bicycle and start using it for trips. And the bicycle can be a keystone habit to all this other stuff that tends to make you wealthier. Sounds kind of strange, but it's really like $1 million machine if you think of it right.
Steve Adeney, or Mr. Money Mustache, as you shall know him online. You're listening to Business Daily from the BBC with Ed Butler. So there's a very practical 21st century version of thrift. Hunting and gathering might feel like taking it a bit far. But those who scavenge amongst the undergrowth for berries, herbs, mushrooms and fruit, otherwise known as foragers, are now gaining in number. I've been known to do it myself, you know. Ironically, nature's free bounty can command pretty high prices on restaurant menus. Elizabeth Hodson put on some sensible shoes and went out into the wilds of East London to find out more for us.
We're just about to go into Hackney Marshes. In London, it's probably the closest to wilderness that you're going to get. And I'm with Tom Hunt from Poker Tapas, a restaurant in the East End of London. Tom, what are you hoping to find in here?
We're hoping to find a few little treats for the restaurant that we can cook up. I know there's a few basics that we can find, like nettles and dandelions.
How long have you been interested in foraging?
Since I was a child. We'd go on long walks throughout the woods and things like that and often pick things up.
It's a lot of trouble to go to for maybe 1 or 2 ingredients on a plate, so why do you do it?
You're making the most of what's around you and bringing elements of the outdoors into your own cooking and into our restaurant, which is nice. Some lovely nettles down here.
We've gingerly made our way down the slope because Tom has spotted something he's pretty excited about.
The common nettle. Yeah, there's loads of them here, and it seems to be the first of the season. Nettles are delicious. We could try one now for the brave. The best thing to do is to fold the nettle into a little parcel and then just pop it in your mouth and eat it. And it's got a very kind of fresh flavour and quite a large depth of flavour, actually. I would make a pesto with them raw, maybe.
We've now come into the restaurant kitchen and you're going to start cooking with the ingredients. So what are you going to do with them?
I need to make the nettle pesto. Okay, it's just nettles, hazelnuts, lemon juice and all that garlic. It's kind of really quite pungent, delicious. It doesn't need any herbs or anything else.
Tom's restaurant isn't short of customers, but then it is in one of the trendiest parts of London. So can foraging reach a mainstream audience? David Turner is a food and drinks analyst at Mintel.
In America, 22% of consumers will plan to visit restaurants that use only locally sourced foods. So then locally sourced, locally foraged. Taking that to the UK, 54% of adults will go to a bar or restaurant that source local ingredients.
In countries like the UK and the US, is foraging just another middle-class fad?
Well, certainly I don't think people are foraging in the US, in Europe and in the UK because there's a great need. It is definitely about consumers wanting to eat local. I think that's a trend that's going to grow over time.
But Richard McComb, a restaurant critic, isn't so sure.
The food industry, the restaurant industry is dominated by fashions. Foraging for now is the big thing. It's right to point out that some excellent chefs have been using foraging as part of their repertoire for years and years and years, for decades, and have done so unrecognised. But just as foraging is big now, I would anticipate that in another 10 years there'll be something else that will come along and knock it off its perch. I can maybe see there being a movement away from it purely because people have got fed up with seeing all sorts of strange weeds, herbaceous plants and items foraged off beaches, which are being passed off as fine dining and haute cuisine.
The restaurant critic Richard McComb ending that report by Elizabeth Hodson. So back to basics. How can we do better at cutting our costs in these austere times? One place to start looking for savings may be in your fridge. We waste a staggering amount of money annually on food waste, according to the Danish food campaigner Selina Yule.
It's about 900 euros a year is used to buy food that is an average family is using to feed their garbage. In the Western society, our food waste is happening mostly in our home, our households, our refrigerators, because we forget to eat all the food and we throw it away. But if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, their food waste is happening in the fields because of the post-harvest food losses and the lack of infrastructure.
So with regard to the rich world, is that just inevitable, or is there something they can do? Because you would imagine, a lot of us will be familiar, we buy a pizza, let's say, we eat 2/3 of it, we've had enough, the rest goes in the bin.
Well, I would say the attention about food waste right now is rising. And here in Denmark, within the last 5 years, Denmark's national food waste has actually been decreased by 25%.
Right, so that's consumers doing that. That's not just supermarkets looking after their stock a bit better.
At the moment, almost every supermarket in Denmark has a strategy to reduce food waste. And it's because of demand of the consumers.
Do you think that's just because the Danes are a socially aware lot who, feel like they should be doing the right thing? I mean, this is kind of a moral issue, isn't it? Or at least that's the way you're pinning it. It doesn't seem to me like most people are being economically motivated to save food.
You know, I started the Stop Wasting Food movement 8 years ago, and we had in Denmark and also in Europe economical crisis. So, of course, people were looking into how to save money. And if you waste 900 euros a year on food waste, that's a tremendous amount of money.
Is it easy?
You know, once you get into that routine, into that, people, for example, they have those overstuffed refrigerators. I'm guilty as well. We all tend to buy too much food and we put it in the back of our refrigerators and we forget all about the food and suddenly the food goes bad. And also our freezers. Every second Dane has UFOs in their freezers.
I beg your pardon? Unidentified flying objects in their freezers?
No, UFOs are the unidentified frozen objects. And basically, it's all the leftovers that you put in the freezer and you forget all about them for a year or two. And then you scoop them up and you say, oh, you don't know what it is. Well, it's better to throw it away.
Selina Yule of the Stop Wasting Food campaign in Denmark. Now, you may be thinking we've heard all of this before. Who's to say that once the global economy properly bounces back, so will our consumer appetites? Well, perhaps you're right. But the thrift historian Andrew Yarrow isn't so sure. He reckons there's reason this time to suspect that the age of the frugal may be with us for a while yet.
We've seen a tremendous rise in inequality and wage stagnation. And, without sufficient wages, it's hard for people to save. In a country like the U.S., retirement security is a huge problem.
So do we therefore need, should we be expecting a different model of capitalism into the future, one which does not depend on people consuming ever more?
I think we do. That would entail huge changes in our economy and our culture and our psyches, really. But I think there needs to be greater equality, greater wage growth, greater opportunity, better models for retirement security, especially as people are living longer. Back in my childhood, people in America would buy new cars every 4 or 5 years. Now the average longevity is 11 years. And ultimately, I think we need to rethink the huge dependence on consumption that our societies and economies have been based on really for the last century.
Andrew Yarrow of the Aspen Institute, and if you are in any way tempted by this life of thrift, please do check out Mr. Money Mustache's website, mrmoneymustache.com. It really is priceless.